On today's episode of Tartan Talks with USA Kilts, we sit down with James Wylie from V&A Dundee. I'd like to welcome James Wylie. He's an Assistant Curator at V&A Dundee and a driving force behind the Tartan Exhibition that's currently on at V&A Dundee now through January 14th. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's an absolute pleasure to be here.
Thank you. So give me your 30-second intro background. Where did you grow up? Where'd you come from? Who'd you do? Where'd you get to where you are right now?
So my background is I'm originally from a farm on the east coast of Scotland. So I've always had wool in my life. Growing up, I got interested in history through my grandparents as well, and rest is actually history, because then I ended up working in the local museums in Angus, and from that actually then went to the art college in Dundee, and from studying art I then sort of jumped ship then over to the V&A Dundee when it first then opened in 2018.
Nice. Now, a lot of people have no idea, I didn't, what goes into a museum's process in setting up an exhibit. And I know that you had something like 100 different people that were involved in, donating items or letting the museum borrow items for the Tartan exhibit. Give me a bit about the behind the scenes on how that works.
So I guess, all starts off with the concept, starts off with the idea. We originally started off looking at a book written by Jonathan Fairs in 2008, funnily enough, called Tartan. And it was when we picked up this book and we flipped through it, and it got us thinking, we can actually probably make an exhibition out of this. So we approached Jonathan, we got him on the team, and we then assembled a curatorial team inside. So there was only like 4 of us working on this absolutely mammoth project. And we just knew as well that when curating a tartan exhibition in Scotland, it wasn't simply going to be just taking a few objects connected to the subject and then placing them in a room together. We had to really kind of spread that net wide, invite as many people to the conversation as possible, and just really get everyone within the sort of cultural landscape in Scotland really enthused about it as well, and they were. So we decided that we would then reach out to National Museum Scotland, a lot of the national sort of lenders, Tate, V&A in South Kensington, but there was a lot of gems sort of hidden away in small private collections as well, and it was these objects that turned out also to be key objects as well. So we had to then kind of keep them on board as well, and we ended up, taking on around about 80 lenders, and that was from, like I said, these different sizes of collections, and also not only ones in Scotland, but then as far afield as North America and even Japan as well. And then, of course, I came up with this bright idea called the People's Tartan, which was our community call-out, where we wanted to really kind of plug the gaps in the show and actually show tartan as a more everyday experience for people, and give people the opportunity to then submit their own items to the show to then show what tartan meant to them. So of course that meant taking on even more lenders, and we ended up with like an additional 20 lenders on top of that. So a lot of conversations going, a lot of paperwork, a lot of logistics involved with that. Basically, to put in a nutshell, it took over my life for the past 2.5 years, ever since its inception in December 2020.
It sounds like a lot of working parts. When you think about a museum, you just think, oh, you just go there and they have all the stuff. Like, no, you guys don't own all of that stuff. You have to get, contracts and, get 100 people's buy-ins on the concept and their willingness to let you borrow their prized possessions. I know you've spoken before about how there's a bit of cultural cringe among some Scots with tartan when it comes to all things tartan. Why do you think tartan needs a spokesperson within Scotland?
Well, I think it's because it's been as you touch upon this idea of cultural cringe, where I think the way how tartan's developed to really become this kind of nexus point of a visual representation of a whole country, it's really kind of created almost like an image which, in some views, has turned out to then be a false image in their viewpoints. And I guess that's something that really kind of factored in, especially in academic circles in around about the late 70s and early 80s as well. And I think now that what's quite interesting, and that's a really kind of tumultuous time politically in Scotland as well. You had the devolution referendum, you had Margaret Thatcher coming into power. So there was really this major point of questioning one's own national identity and what that was represented like on the national stage. And here we are again, in fact, at a point where there is a lot of kind of political upheaval. We've had a referendum in 2014, but I think now that there's been a lot of time that's then passed from that initial sort of introspective look, and there is a lot of research that's been sort of going out then into the subject of which there wasn't the capacity for back then. So I think when it comes to the textile, the cloth, the pattern needing an ambassador, a spokesperson, is really to actually almost safeguard it in a way. And by safeguard, I don't mean necessarily kind of like gatekeep the subject. I just mean safeguard the knowledge that has been generated around its production, safeguarding the fact that there's a consistent register that doesn't schism onto different registers. And also, I think, protecting sort of the material survivors of tartan that still survives, and protecting that for future generations as well.
Yeah. Do you think that it's, broadly speaking, and I know I'm asking you to speak for all Scots to some degree, and so I apologize. But do you think it's, as a trend, do you think it's where you're getting, as a country, do you think you're getting to a better place with the cultural cringe aspect? Or do you think it's getting worse because more people, more designers, more fashion people are kind of playing with it as in within elements of things?
I think in Scotland that there's still the political divide, and that's something I think that's always going to be within the nation's history when it comes to how we view ourselves as a country, how we view the images that actually represent ourselves as a nation. And I think also on both sides of the divide, there's also a point where everyone kind of still engages with tartan on some level. I don't think there's ever an aspect where people completely shut it out of their sort of life within the sort of Scottish cultural scene, because it's always there. I could bring it forward one example of fact, somebody who was on our advisory panel, and they absolutely thought they detested the subject, but then we rightly pointed out, in fact, they used tartan within their own work as well. So it was really something that they couldn't really escape from. So I think there is definitely almost a bit of a reckoning that's happening, and it's one that people are kind of getting to grips with and not taking it too seriously as well. Because I think that's really where it all came from, is people just taking tartan too seriously. I mean, it is a serious subject. There's a lot of thought and consideration that goes into its research and development. But I think there's a point as well where you've got to kind of just, live with it.
Yeah, and there's a sliding scale between people's individuals' opinions or desires on the matter, on whether they want to be uber traditional and they want to honor the tradition and just wear things for formal events in a very traditional way, or on the other end of the scale, fashion designers just playing with it as a pattern within their own art form and within their own expression within a fashions kind of setting.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's certainly that point where you have fashion designers who will be totally transgressive with it. They will not that they're not being considerate of its history and of its heritage, but they actually just see it as a means to an end to really kind of actually say in some circles, either break up the form of the human body, or they'll be looking for ways to use that color and the pattern to then, sort of break up the profile as well. Or you'll have fashion designers who, like Alexander McQueen, who will actually be really resonant with that history, will really sort of dive into it and then, well, in Alexander McQueen's case, actually then used the clan tartan as that sort of almost branding to his work as well. So it's a shifting scale of how people engage with it, and yeah, I think it's all at the end of the day, it's very subjective.
Now, we talk here a lot about what tartan means to those of us in the diaspora around the world, how it's such a cultural marker of Scottishness, so to speak. In your experience, what are the differences that those in the diaspora kind of use tartan for and use it in their own expression versus how it's used in Scotland, whether it's fashion, whether it's heritage, whether, how we introduce it into our lives?
That's a really interesting question, in fact, because, there's definitely a way to shift it of, is this, what are the differences? But also I think it's great and important to remember sort of what is the connections and what connects those together as well. Because when it comes to connection, I think there's folk in Scotland, will like what the tradition is now in sort of North America and the diaspora. They will wear their tartan because it's, their tartan, their sort of family tartan. And I think the attitude only really change is when it becomes the frequency of when that's worn, and also in what form it's worn as well. So you'll find in Scotland every day on the street, somebody might have, a tartan scarf that they've bought, within their family tartan, or in many cases, they just love the colour of what that tartan is. But also, I think it especially is one thing that tartan over here tends to kind of be reserved for a little bit for formal events. Weddings, ceilidhs, burn suppers, graduations as well. So the only other time you'll really find sort of kilt wearing in Scotland is if, you're someone who's a real sort of academic to the subject, if you're trying to be kind of like a bit of a transgressive fashionista, or if you're an absolute crank like myself. So yeah, the kilt wearing, I think, is certainly something that grows stronger with distance. So it's something that I think, from my observations anyway, you see it as more of an everyday kind of experience for those who want to sort of tap into their own heritage as well, because that's what's, I guess, is so what's so powerful about tartan. It is this sort of visual marker of one's feeling of their own place in the world, especially when it comes to within the diaspora circles, of that sort of feeling of one's displacement from the supposed, kind of like home country. And also I think it's quite unfair, I think, because I think there's a lot of sort of opinions that come out of Scotland where people sort of view kind of the diaspora wearing tartan and not actually thinking that they should be wearing it or they're not doing it right. But actually, I think once, that sort of almost severance is there, it's completely out of the home country's hands. This is completely for the diaspora to make up how they will represent themselves in their own identities. So I think what actually differs is kind of those sort of the frequency. But what's actually one thing that I've noticed that really is something that doesn't really change, on this side of the Atlantic or the other, is those who take traditional kilting seriously. You'll find that it's very sort of well united on what the approaches are, what the sort of, even the amount of research and collegiateness between folk is very united on that front. So yeah, some differences of opinion, but I think there's a lot united as well.
One thing that somebody had said to me in the past, Scott said to me in the past, that made sense, and I want to get your sense of whether you believe it to be, broadly speaking, kind of true as well. He said to me that Americans and Scots are wearing kilts for different reasons. Americans are wearing it as a connection to their family heritage, generally speaking, and Scots are wearing it as more of a national identity, pride in their country, as a basic, broadly speaking, type reason. Do you find that to be reasonably accurate, or nope, Scots are wearing it for the same reasons? Tell me.
That's actually a really good question, because I think on that front, we are wearing it for different reasons, but I think even then in Scotland, there's even different reasons of why kilts are then being sort of worn in Scotland. So you do have this kind of, it might be, this sort of national umbrella, but when it comes to, certain contexts, such as like aforementioned weddings, it is kind of tapping into that exact sort of feeling that folk within the diaspora hold as well for their own family lineage. That's why you would see, from my own experience anyway, my dad, my uncles as well, all wearing the MacLeod tartan, just because my great-grandfather was a MacLeod, and it all kind of descends from there. So it's actually what stories we kind of latch into on our own lineages that I think are something that sort of connects within that. But yeah, when it comes to that sort of national umbrella, that's certainly in the realms of the Tartan Army, football matches, Scots ambassadors abroad like that, who will kind of then make that representation under one roof.
Right. The thing that I found curious is and the reason I brought it up as far as national or just a broader meaning behind it versus familial necessarily, is also the proliferation of universal and like fashiony type tartans through the hire industry in Scotland versus like renting clan tartans. I know like currently for McCall's or any of the big hire places, there's a lot, like they're almost exclusively, universal or fashion tartans, not Royal Stewart, Campbell, McLeod type things to rent. Do you find that as well or no?
Yeah, I think that's a major factor of where things have changed here, as the kilt hire industry has changed in Scotland over the past 20 years as well. There is kind of this, you'll find that there's a lot of tartans out there which are kind of, your kind of greys and your purples, and really sort of like, I guess it's just seeing a shift in fashions as like even contained within the kilt hire industry, is how you would see fashions change, within sort of contemporary design, or even within the traditional Highland attire community as well. So I think it's something that is definitely going to be with us for a while. And it's also, I think it's, a lot of it's actually, I think, down to just getting the aesthetic right, which I think is a lot of concerns for many kind of Scots for their weddings nowadays. They want that sort of, that perfect sort of visual marker, and they're not really too concerned, I guess, about the lineage. There are those who are, of course, but they are more actually wanting to kind of, give that aspect of sort of Scottishness to it, and that level of, in their minds, authenticity.
So how have your own personal views of tartan changed or evolved over the years?
I was exposed to tartan, I think, early on from my granny, and I think it's because since it was always in my life, I didn't really kind of take too much notice of it. I've always got a sort of personal, I guess, sort of positive memory connected to those times, and I think that's how it was so easy for me to kind of take on the subject when eventually actually I was then involved in the Tartan Exhibition, because I'm certainly no specialist, and if anything, I think I now have a completely newfound respect for tartan, and that was just purely through the amount of hours of research going into the subject and speaking with as many folk from across that landscape as possible, and even really trying to then get a real understanding of the cloth through the likes of what Peter MacDonald are doing, where they began weaving the tartan. And I thought, okay, now that I curate the Tartan Exhibition with my colleagues Kirsty and Barry and Jonathan, I think it's now about time that I kind of learn how to actually weave tartan as well. So I kind of did it back to front. But after I did that, I then found, I kind of then got it. I got a bit of an epiphany, about that sort of materiality and that sort of extra care that goes into the textile and that process. Ask me 3 years ago, what my thoughts are on tartan, I'd be like, I wore it to my wedding last year. That's probably about it.
You are, but now through your time at the museum and through the exhibition, You are a sincere student of the culture, as we say.
Quite so, indeed. I'm very much a tartanista now.
So we know that you have a very, very important piece in the exhibition, the Glen Affric tartan. Why don't you tell me how you came into possession of that and kind of what the story of that one was?
Since we had approached the Scottish Tartans Authority and Peter MacDonald from the early days as an early stakeholder in the exhibition, we'd turned round to John Peter, asked him, do you have any, early examples, any, proto-tartans in your collection? And Peter said, yes, we do have this fragment. It was found in Glen Affric. It was they reckoned it was in a peat bog as well. And do you want to come view it? So as and when I then viewed the Scottish Tartans Authority's objects, they kindly brought along this fragment of textile as well. And actually just looking at it and just actually then hearing how enthused Peter was about how little we knew about it, I kind of felt like there was something there to kind of scratch away and kind of uncover. So I said to them both, why don't I take this back to my curatorial colleagues? I'll lobby for this to see if we can include this within the show, if potentially some more research is done into it. And of course, the rest is history. We have then Scottish Tartans Authority kindly conducted dye analysis through the National Museum Scotland, and then radiocarbon 14 dating through the laboratory in Glasgow. And we hoped that would then give us a result and answer of what we could actually then put on the interpretation panel, because I'd written that up as a very general statement of possibly before 18th century. So we didn't know for definite, but we certainly trust Peter's judgment when it comes to his 40-year experience with the textile. So it was actually then just in the final few weeks before opening the exhibition that we got that result back from the Scottish Tartans Authority, that it wasn't 18th century, it wasn't 17th century, it was, we're talking about 16th century. So this was pushing the goalposts back by, a good 300 years of where we thought they were. So having that 95% confidence level between 1500 and 1600, you can't argue with the science. It was a really, really old piece of textile, a really special piece of textile. And in fact, it really did pick up the traction then once we announced it to the world in that week before opening.
So where did they have the tartan at the STA? Was it in like the back of a filing cabinet somewhere tucked away in a box because they didn't know what to do with it? Or what was their story of how they brought it forward?
So they always had it within their collection store, and it was material. It was handed then into what was then the precursor for the Scottish Tartans Authority and Scottish Tartans Society in the 1980s. And so they kind of always knew they had it. It was just, I guess there wasn't really that opportunity to really kind of do something with it. And that's really because the last time, apart from the Amazing, Wild and Majestic show in 2018-19, which had a particular lens of Highlandism, there wasn't really an opportunity to kind of show a sort of a wide variety of different sort of tartan material, because the last exhibition that had been in Scotland was in the early 1990s. So it was just a real point of, I guess, happenstance and opportunity that this had arisen.
Now, I know that the Falkirk tartan is actually older than Glen Affric. Why is the Glen Affric tartan as, if not more important than the Falkirk tartan?
I think that's what was actually quite remarkable, was the great debate that this started online when we first, between ourselves and the STA, announced it to the world. Was you had many folk, say, oh, well, actually, we have this fragment called the Falkirk tartan that dates from the 3rd century. And that's actually the oldest tartan in Scotland. And I guess it really we relished that debate a little bit because it really got everyone speaking about, what does make tartan. And I guess what separates the Glen Affric textile from the Falkirk fragment or the Falkirk tartan was the fact that the Falkirk fragment, it's composed of two different two different colours of wool. They're undyed, so they're using natural fleece. It's woven in a check style, so an equal sort of square pattern that's being created all the way throughout. When the Falkirk fragment was produced, the whole concept of Scotland didn't exist. There was yet to be a Scotland for like another 500 years at least. When the concept of Alapa had come together as one kind of unified country, and you had a very sort of similar textile tradition all the way throughout Iron Age Europe at the time of these sort of woven checkered textiles. And people were using it as an everyday cloth, but it's only really when you jump forward to the 14th, 15th, 16th century that you then actually have the word tartan come into the lexicon as well. When it comes to the actual properties of the Glen Affric, it's woven with multiple dye stuffs. It's also a complex pattern as well. So it's composed of checks over stripes, sort of layered over the top of one another. So it's actually creating a bit of a, like what you see in many tartans, a bit of a three-dimensionality about it, a bit of sort of layering going on and seeing this really wonderful sort of interplay of colour happening that's actually making it such an attractive force that it is today. So I think that's why we're sort of creating that difference. And when it comes to, in fact, the Falkirk fragment, I know this is me throwing some shade at it. I absolutely love the Falkirk fragment, but it was actually, I guess, a bit of a romantic term given to that fragment back when Henshaw wrote their paper in the 1950s and called it as such. Because within that same paper that was written, you have other woven check textiles being discussed, but none of those are ever called tartan in a sense. So I think it was just something that's kind of built its own mythology over time.
So moving beyond the Glen Affric tartan, a little bit more about the rest of the exhibit. If you had to pick your favorite either piece or something within either the museum or the exhibit, the tartan exhibit itself, what would your favorite piece be?
If I had to sort of just pick out one object that wasn't the Glen Affric, because everyone loves the Glen Affric, it would probably be the wonderful sort of composition that we have, where we have an original banyan or wrapping gown from around about the mid-18th century, and there's a really stunning, beautiful portrait of a gentleman known as Sir Robert Dalrymple of Castleton, and he's also then wearing a wrapping gown, and it's probably the only piece of portraiture in oils that actually depicts somebody wearing one of these sort of tartan wrapping gowns. And what I love about it is because we have this whole idea of what Highland dress is, that you had trews, you had the great kilt as well, but you also had this other kind of fashion that was developing at the time for these really informal sort of coats that one would wear in their house, or even sometimes out in the environs as well. And I really think it's a special representation of this really little known sort of kind of like fashion trend for tartan. And I think also then to sort of expand upon it, the painting itself was actually then painted in 1743. So that's a really significant date, because the sitter, who was actually had passed on at the time because it was a posthumous portrait, he was a Hanoverian supporter. He was a major sort of supporter for the Union, and it's then a period of time where tartan's actually been seen as a bit of a political force for then Jacobitism. So you can see how there's still this sort of shifting idea of what then tartan's representing. So it's not just purely this nationalistic sort of lens or Jacobite lens. It's actually one who's kind of actually sort of showing support for one's love of one's own country as well, no matter what side of the divide they're on. So yeah, you can probably tell I can speak about this portrait for hours. I just love it. It's so good because it goes alongside then this original banyan, which is from that period. So to make that sort of linkage between the two is just so good.
And it's one thing that I never thought about it through this lens before, was that we are so obsessed with, the origins of tartan as it relates to Highland dress, and looking back at, we'll never know when the first kilt was made, but we're trying to get as much, data about that as we can, or how it evolved over the time or through time, and how it was worn in Scotland in relates to Highland dress, but never or seldomly how it relates to fashion and the origins of that story within it. We're always thinking about Highland dress aspect as a symbol of national, identity, and the national, dress, national costume, if you will. But that's an interesting thing, going at it from the lens of the origins of the fashion angle of it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we always think that, I guess contemporary designers and fashion designers are actually kind of, pulling tartan away from its real origins and its real kind of, I guess, authenticity about it. But in fact, this is something that's been always happening with the cloth, with the textile. I mean, the first ever fashion prints that are coming out of France, of showing the Marvelousses wearing all these really daring dresses. You also have ones depicting tartan being sort of composed of that, but it's also happening at the exact same time. The Highland Society of London are starting to then sort of categorize and actually then collect, this idea and formulate this idea of clan tartans. So they've really went hand in hand. And like the aforementioned idea of these wrapping gowns and banyans, that being a fashionable trend that really comes around because of the so-called West's connections then with the trade happening in Japan, in India, and then bringing this new cut of garment over to Europe for then to have these European cloths and textiles and apply to them.
One thing we've often said is that, tartan is Scotland's gift to the world. And now I'm realizing that statement has been true for much longer than I'm thinking it has actually been true. It's a very interesting angle on this whole thing.
And I think as well, you have the idea then that actually, it's been almost like a two-way dialogue as well, because there's so much that actually, tartan has then found itself being, applied to new forms, new fabrics, new ideas, all across the world, and actually then kind of completely being reinvented to have its then own meaning within these contexts. So, I think it's like this example with the wrapping gown. If it wasn't for these links, across the world, then we would never kind of have what I call like the great granddaddy of the tartan dressing gown we have today. So, yeah.
So as a researcher / investigator throughout your entire role in putting the entire tartan exhibition together, what is the one nagging question that you have eating at your soul or at the back of your brain that will probably never be answered, but it's the question you would love to have answered, or if you could travel back in time and see a particular thing in a particular moment, what is that thing?
I mean, there's so many questions that actually still arise. We think we put on a tartan exhibition and we start then kind of answering a lot of questions, but it actually just dredges up more. One major question is, have something like, the Glen Affric find. When will we find, another major discovery like that again? Is a big question. But the one that really goes through my mind is actually, after looking at the textile of the pattern of the Glen Affric, is actually, what was that weaver thinking? How did they think about how they were setting out that pattern were they even thinking about it? And what exactly then were they hoping that textile would be used as well? So these are all things, give me a time machine, I'll go back, I'll try and find that person. Because it's kind of like the mysteries we'll just never know. And it's one thing that I think, we've got to kind of come to terms with. And I think it's easily something to come to terms with, because that's just tartan's allure. There's many myths. There's many stories that are kind of passed down, a lot of mistruths as well. But that would be the major one, is kind of, what were you thinking? What were you wanting to do with this? What was it going to become? And how did you end up, whoever this person may be, how did it end up there? Just, I want to know.
It's one of the weird, satisfying and frustrating parts of my journey within all this as well, is the more you learn, the more you realize you don't know. And the more you know, the more you realize you don't know. So I can imagine you're probably similar as well in doing your research, and now you find 2 little bits of information, but now you have 10 more questions that you're unanswered. Then you got to start digging at them. So it's exhilarating and frustrating simultaneously.
Absolutely. It's, if anything, it's kind of, even though, the exhibition's on, it's on show, there's, so many things that we've tried to tap into and telling that story. But there's kind of there's so much work that I'm still even doing in my own time afterward, of thinking, this story would have been interesting to tell. This one also, going down this rabbit hole, would have been a really kind of interesting factor to play around with and kind of explore in further detail. So yeah, it's always kind of you've always got to kind of, come to terms with the limitations of just, there's only so much time that we have, and there's only so much things that we're going to find out within our lifetimes.
How do you balance the long-standing tradition of tartan with the way that the fashion industry just kind of plays with it? Heritage versus fashion. How do you live with both of those things in one body?
I guess, well, curatorially, it's making sure that we are shouting out about how that tradition of clan tartans originally formed, to make sure that we are kind of respecting that history, that heritage, and also while all the way interrogating it as well, and also kind of trying to show, that sort of bridging that gap between 2 subjects, or one you see as 2 different elements, because I think I touched upon it before, but the whole time that we've had sort of traditional Highland attire and clan tartans, there's always been this sort of fashion market going alongside it. And that's through, the numerous sort of fancy tartans that were being sort of churned out by Wilsons of Bannockburn, the ones that, weren't even given names, they were just kept as pattern, number 17, number 18. So it just shows that there's such a driving demand for it. But I think what we see now with contemporary designers is only just the next evolvement of that sort of living tradition that really started with the likes of Wilsons of Bannockburn, and they're just really kind of pushing it into the next stage. And that's, again, sort of looking at some contemporary fashion designers who are really kind of, I guess, respectful of the history as well, and also, the fashion designers who are actually just utilizing the textile because it's a bonny colour to use. It's a bonny pattern, one that's actually going to make whoever's wearing it really stand out. And I think that's something that's always going to kind of unite, actually, both traditional attire and contemporary fashion, is they're both kind of trying to establish the same thing at the end of the day. They're trying to stand out.
That's a very good point. I know a lot of people, especially in wearing kilts, we describe them as the peacocks. You want to be loud and proud, as you said, in your outfit. So where do you see the future of tartan going, either within fashion or within Highland dress? What do you see as the next stage, the next evolution of the cloth?
So I think it's certainly going to continue to blossom anyway. As with tartan, there's always going to be sort of ebbs and flows about its popularity. These real sort of saturation points that you'll find over its history as well. And I think that will continue to happen. The fashion industry, they'll continue to produce exciting designs and possibilities akin to, your Westwoods and your McQueens, Charles Jeffrey, who I've touched upon, and the likes even of Nicholas Daly are certainly ones to watch. But also I look forward to actually seeing what the next sort of major trend within the sort of traditional kilt circle is as well. Because that is something that's, subtly moving in Scotland through, the use of more sort of greys and tartans that don't have specific family connections for weddings. But I'd like to sort of put that idea of, if we are going, 100 years into the future, what's going to be our or what will be then sort of the Prince Charlie jacket of that time in the future? What are they going to view upon as we kind of view upon the Prince Charlie jacket's formation in the 1920s? Because there's bound to be something that is going to shift that style as well. That's either going to, push it forward into a new kind of idea of what traditional is, or is going to then kind of more kind of turn back and then look at sort of the really kind of earlier sort of modes of production and tartan wearing as well. And, you never know, you might have the full Highland revival outfit coming out and being a major thing again of its tartan top to toe. And I wouldn't mind that.
I've noticed the same kind of thing is that, there's a bit of a trend towards the Romanticism, towards the Victorian style. And it all comes in cycles. Fashion goes in cycles where it's now kind of looking back before you look forward and then taking bits and elements of the past, then dragging it, kicking and screaming into the future. So I don't think I see in the near future any like Star Trek super streamlined type outfits for the next version of the Prince Charlie. But I think that the next current thing will be more Sheriff Muirs and Montrose and those kind of jackets and styles brought back into fashion before it gets to the next thing.
Yeah, I'd certainly agree with that. I think you'll start to maybe see a refinement of those. So like you said with the Montrose, you might find that they'll have a bit more of a modern cut to them, a bit more of a modern twist, and by sort of modern, I mean that, a lot of the kind of elements will sort of be sort of minimalized or reduced or finessed in a way. Is certainly the direction of travel that I would see it going. And I think as well, it really depends on, I think, how the elements of like sort of tweed kilt jackets moves as well. Because, are the elements of that going to be reduced? Are they going to be, sort of made into a different form as well? Fortunately, I don't think we'll see the full tartan get-up anytime soon, but you're certainly going to see some development on that front, I think.
So what's the number one thing that you want people to know about V&A Dundee, and why is what you all collectively are doing so important?
So the number one thing I think I'd love folk to know about us is we don't have a collection. So, if you'd love to offer something to us, happy days. Thank you so much. We really appreciate the offer, but unfortunately we can't, store it or keep it. But it forces us to work collaboratively with people. And that is why tartan has so many folk involved with it, because we do need to ask other folk for assistance, for help. So actually, to make tartan happen, I think what's happened is it's certainly made the exhibition far more enriching, in my opinion. The fact that we've not just turned to one source collection and kind of unpacked that in a way, but when you invite so many voices to the table, much like the definitions of tartan, in fact, Scottish design here and how we have it in the museum is very subjective. It's a subject open to many possibilities, and it means actually what's possible to curate within a tartan exhibition, within a museum of Scottish design, is really endless opportunities to put aspects together. So I think that's what I'd like to leave with folk, is the fact that, Scottish design, it's not just a narrow view of, tartan, kilts, Charles Rennie Mackintosh, the Glasgow style. There's many connections still to be made and to be had.
So as you're the guest, I'm going to give you the final thought. What words of wisdom would you share with someone who's either wanting to work for a museum or wants to work in conservation type practices?
So I would say with that, never fear if you don't have a subject in mind that you want to specialise in. Because I didn't find tartan, and this is going to sound really gushy, but tartan found me. So it unlocked something within me, this generalist that I am. And so there's no qualms about having sort of disparate niches that you feel don't connect together. I mean, I got involved in curatorial practice through restoring nuclear bunkers. That's got nothing to do with tartan whatsoever, but here I am. So yeah, just never fear over that aspect. Keep to a generalist and let your passions find you.
So for those who want to see the exhibit, when is it running through, and is it ever going to go on the road?
Oh, well, so the exhibition, we have it still here till the 14th of January. So still, plenty of time if you're in the neighbourhood. And when it comes to that second question, I guess I could quote from the lines of Bonnie Dundee that you've not seen the last of our bonnets and me. So we're very much, in all seriousness, the ambition's there to put it on the road. So just watch this space. Very good.
Well, we'll put a link down below in the comments or in the description so that people can follow it and figure out if it does, whether it's 2 months from now or 2 years from now, they can figure out how to get in touch or how to find the exhibit and be able to experience it for themselves. James, I want to thank you very much for spending time with me today. This has been a very, very enlightening, insightful conversation. So cheers to you, my man.
Thank you. It was a great chinwag.
I want to thank James again for taking time out of his day to speak with us about all the cool stuff that they do at the V&A Dundee Museum. If you're in Scotland or if you're visiting Scotland, please make sure to go check it out. They do a lot of really, really cool stuff. Also, if you want to see us interview other people as part of our Tartan Talk series, go check out that video over there.